This is KCCK's Culture Crawl. I'm Dennis Green, and my guest today is Tim Hankewich, back for another concert with Orchestra Iowa coming up this weekend, and the title is Rebellious Russians.
Nostrovia, good to be here. Yes, it just demands a little bit of vodka to it. It's just
Okay, now we know what's going to be in Tim's water bottle.
That's right.
At the podium.
That's right. Yeah. So obviously, as a Ukrainian, I am partial to Slavic music, and so at least once or twice or 3 or 4 times a year, you see this kind of music appear in my programming. And one of the things I like about Russian music in general is its high octane sort of writing. Brass players love it. And some of the pieces that we're performing include the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, which will just part your hair. I mean, this is something that brass players really love to play. But we're also taking a different angle on the direction of Russian music. For example, we have some Tsarist music that from the Romantic era with Borodin, Polovetzian dances, and people would maybe know it from Kismet. It was kind of one of the source materials for that Broadway musical. And it was also extraordinarily popular because of its lyricism and the like. And then, of course, we get to the communist era with Shostakovich, where he wrote this symphony because he was literally criticized for having his music being too difficult to listen to, and his life was actually being threatened. Yeah, they took their art much more seriously back then.
You thought it was bad to get tough tweets.
Yeah, that's a bad review. Yeah, and so he
when the police knock on your door and tell you need to change your compositional style.
Yeah, exactly. I think people get a little too uptight with things today. So anyway, lots of artists were fearing for their lives at the time that Shostakovich wrote this Fifth Symphony of his, and it turned out to be a triumph, which even to this day is amongst the greatest symphonies ever written. But there's also a third way. So we have the Tsarist and we have the sort of Stalinist approach to music making. And then there's this guy by the name of Igor Stravinsky, who
totally did his own thing.
Totally did his own thing. And he was born and raised sort of in this Tsarist romantic tradition. And then in the 1920s went to France, which had a much more cosmopolitan atmosphere and internationalist sort of way of composing. And then he ultimately came to the United States and became a U.S. citizen. And this piece that we're performing, Dumbarton Oaks, signifies his last piece that he wrote in France, but it was a U.S. commission. It really represents his transition from Europe to the United States. And, of course, it was right in 1938, 39, so the winds of war were brewing in Europe. And so all of the great artistic and scientific minds of Europe were emigrating to the United States, much to our benefit. And so this piece is really an American take on Russian music, and we have Ballet Quad Cities performing with it. Not that it was intended to be a ballet to begin with in its original conception, but Stravinsky's mainstay, everything he wrote pretty much, had dance involved, whether it's his early ballets or late. So this kind of music lends itself to dance a lot.
Talking with Tim Hankewich about Rebellious Russians, which is coming up the 6th and the 7th. Yes, I get that right?
Yeah, Friday night at Coralville Center for the Performing Arts, and then we reprise it again in Cedar Rapids at the Paramount Theatre. Both performances start at 7:30 with a pre-concert lecture beforehand.
You perform several times a year with Ballet Quad Cities.
Correct, yeah.
But usually it's a staged ballet with the orchestra in the pit. I'm guessing you're not going to play this concert from the pit or move at intermission from the stage to the pit.
Ed Carr, our operations manager, would shoot me if we did that. So
tell me a little bit about fitting an orchestra and dancers on the same stage.
So think of, in this case, dancers very much being our guest artist, like a soloist. So it's going to be a smaller troupe. And this Dumbarton Oaks, which by the way is inspired by the Dumbarton grounds in Washington D.C. area, the gardens are absolutely glorious, and I think the properties now belong to Harvard. That's just an aside, but the piece is actually for a very small ensemble. So we'll have a small ensemble far upstage. It gives the dancers plenty of room to dance. And it's only about a 12, 14-minute piece. And then we quickly reset the stage for our larger forces for the Polovetzian dances and Shostakovich 5, which is this like massive, bloated, huge thing. And we were talking off air how important it is to be able to manage the stage so that there's not a complete stoppage in the performance.
Right.
Because to completely rebuild the stage could take 10, 15
stopping
minutes.
the show for 15 minutes, probably not optimal.
Not fun. But so what's going to happen is that during that time, I'm going to be announcing our next season. Door for our future.
Nice. Okay, so
not just a hat rack.
Yeah, pull focus away. Pay no attention. Pay no attention to the busy people scurrying around on
behind
the
screen.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of that this year too.
The concert is Rebellious Russians, Friday and Saturday at the Coralville Center for the Performing Arts and at the Paramount Theatre. Now, you mentioned that you have Ukrainian ancestry.
Yeah, most people, when they see the word Hankewich or Hankewich, Scottish does not come to mind. And indeed, my paternal grandfather and grandmother came from the southern Ukraine area.
So have you always had kind of a connection to the music of Eastern Europe, or is that something you kind of started studying more?
My dad and my paternal side, they were all sort of amateur musicians. My dad played the accordion, and my uncle not only played the accordion, but the mandolin and all sorts of things like that. And my extended family in the old country, Saskatchewan, they are all super uber Ukrainian nationalists. I mean, they learned the language and everything. I think my immediate family was sort of the black sheep of the family that emigrated to Canada, and we're the only ones who really didn't continue the culture. So I know that on my immediate family, there's a lot of very red-blooded Ukrainians out there.
You mentioned the horns,
right?
But are there any other characteristics of the music of Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe that is different from, of course, we talked about the effect of politics in the 20th century on the music.
So what was happening historically in the turn of the century, all composers worldwide were focusing on their own country's folk music. The United States was doing it, Russia was doing it, and there's something in the DNA of folk music, and what I mean by that are sort of the nursery rhyme songs that children grow up with in their society. I mean, we all know Yankee Doodle, which is a folk song, and then what composers would do was take would allude to that folk song or style and put it into their music.
Well, because it was a familiarizing point with the audience.
Right, exactly right.
Dvorak would be an example that we're very familiar with in our area.
Perfect example. And so that was what was common around the 1900s. So when the Soviets came to power, they tripled down on that. And so which led to an interesting artistic problem was how do you incorporate folk song, which usually has a pretty simple melodic content to it, to a more modern harmonic context. And this is where the tension lay, because sometimes if your music was considered too dissonant, well, the Russian officials would come after you, and this is exactly
again the police knocking on your door,
literally knocking on your door,
with questions about your compositional
And there were many
style.
composers and writers and actors who literally disappeared in the middle of the night, never to be heard from again. And so there's a lot of this Russian folk element to Shostakovich, but there's also a triumphalist political overtone to this particular piece. But also, Shostakovich wasn't necessarily a true believer in. Maybe he was a true believer in communism, but not necessarily a true believer in the Stalinist regime. And so there's actually some subversive parts to his music as well. The slow movement is incredibly tragic and mournful, and it's gorgeous. But I think it's also not only the brooding nature of the Slavs, but I think it's also his own way of mourning the sort of tight-gripped political atmosphere he was writing in.
The concert is Rebellious Russians, March 6th and 7th with Orchestra Iowa and Ballet Quad Cities in a unusual twist, having them one of your Masterworks concerts.
Correct.
Very cool idea.
Yeah, I think so too. And again, to consider them not as the main event, but just as sort of a guest artist for the first piece that we'll be performing.
If people want tickets, they can get them at
1-800-369-TUNE, TUNE, or you can go online to artsiowa.com or orchestraiowa.org, or you can walk into Opus and just talk to a person and buy 400 tickets.
that would be Tim's preference. Thanks, Tim.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You can hear the Culture Crawl live on the radio most weekdays at 10:20, or download the podcast, watch or listen on your own schedule at kcck.org/culture, or using your favorite podcast app. I'm Dennis Green, and I'll talk to you later.